Do you want to know more about people's journeys and understand how they take decisions and solve problems in their day-to-day lives? Tune in to the Nails and Hammers podcast to master from what others have already figured out in life. Our guest for today is Aditya Vashistha, who is an assistant professor at Cornell University. Hi Aditya, welcome to the Nails and Hammers podcast.
Hi Kushal, so excited to be here.
So I just wanted to start from the very beginning. Can you share a bit with us about where did you grow up and what all did you study?
Yeah, I grew up in a beautiful city of Jaipur. It's also called Pink City. Did my high schooling from Jaipur. I was a student in Kendriya Vidyalaya number 1, the government school system. Then I went to JP Institute of Information Technology for my bachelor's. And after that, I worked for 4 years. And then I went to my master's to get a master's and PhD from University of Washington in computer science and engineering.
Makes sense. So what did you want it to be when you grew up?
You remember like there used to be like slam books. I don't know like what's the right name for it, but there used to be like a page where you can like answer some questions like what is your date of birth and so in some of those slam books, when I revisit, like I wrote, I want to be an engineering qualified IAS officer, like Indian Administrative Services officer. So that's what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I wasn't planning on becoming a computer scientist when I was a kid. I actually didn't know much about science. I mean, of course, I knew the science which we were reading in the school and learning in the school. But what I wanted to be is very different than what I am right now.
Then you said that like after an undergrad, you worked for 4 years.
Yes.
So what made you decide to quit your job and start working with farmers?
So I actually didn't quit my job to work with farmers, and I can like provide more context to the listeners or viewers here. So I graduated with a information sciences degree, like computer science degree, in from JP Institute of Information Technology, and then like many people, I was preparing for MBA entrance examinations, and that's what I thought. Like my career aspirations evolved from being an IAS officer to an MBA from one of the IIMs in the country, and I was preparing for that, and then I was recruited by Infosys. And during that time, I wanted to be in the research lab, like Infosys Research or Infosys Labs back then was a research arm of the company, which was looking at some really interesting problems. So I reached out to them. I told them like, hey, I'm interested in doing research. Would you be willing to give me an opportunity? And unexpectedly, they recruited me as a software engineer. And the role was software engineer, but it was more or less like a researcher. So I started working on multimedia security, algorithms, and systems at Infosys Labs, worked there for 2 years. And by the end of 2 years, I was like, this is interesting, like what I'm doing, working on computer vision and stuff, but can I do something else with the skills I have? And I was looking at social inequities in India, which is everywhere. Like they're stone throw away, different kinds of social ills. And I was wondering like if the skills which I have can be used to improve the socioeconomic outcomes for underserved communities, which is when I stumbled on the work of Microsoft Research India. They still have a dedicated group of researchers working on technology for emerging markets, which is when I started working on some of these socially impactful problems. So I didn't leave my corporate job to do this. All this work was part of the corporate job I was doing.
So then you left Infosys and joined MSR at that time.
Yes. Yeah. And even during the end of my tenure at Infosys, I was looking at some of these socially impactful problems. And there were only a handful of people who were looking at some of the things I was interested in. But MSR, Microsoft Research, had a lot more people, an established group, a history of very impactful projects. So that's why I gravitated towards them. I interviewed there, they recruited me, and I started working as an assistant researcher, focusing on information and communication technologies for development as a research.
You said that you wanted to be an IAS officer growing up. So, I mean, basically doing work for social impact. So was that always in the back of your mind that the work you wanted to do had social impact?
Yes, but I don't like bureaucracies. Not a big fan of it. And my father was a government officer, and I saw like some of the bureaucracies involved, and didn't find them pleasing always.
Mhm.
And that's why like I gravitated towards like being an MBA. And I think like when growing up, the reason why I wanted to be an IS was many, like certainly like social impact, like but also the prestige and the power which the position gives you to implement your ideas. Also like was inspired by my father, who was in the government and working for the welfare of people of India. So some of those things influenced my ambition to be an IS officer when I was growing up.
And then after, I mean, while you were at MSR, you must have applied to PhD programs out there. So what made you think of pursuing graduate school?
I actually wasn't sure like whether I want a PhD or not, or in some way or the other. I liked the things which I was doing at Microsoft Research. I was really interested in entrepreneurship, and that's the reason like why I wanted to. At one point of time, I wanted to go to B schools because I was thinking of social impact driven entrepreneurship. And at Microsoft Research, like I had a lot of conversations with my advisors, with my mentors there. And when working there for 2 years, I realized that I really enjoy the process of research, and which is what my observation was at Infosys as well. I really enjoyed doing research back then. At MSR, like it gave me a bigger purpose because I enjoyed the process of doing research, and I also enjoyed the research I'm doing, like the area where I was trying to make a dent. And one of my mentors at Microsoft Research told me that you need to have a PhD to have a career in research. And he gave me a great analogy of driving. So, like, think of doing research as an act of driving, and PhD is more or less like a license to drive. So, inspired from many such conversations with my mentors, I applied to PhD programs in the United States.
So usually what people say is that like before you join a PhD program, you should know what you're getting into or what you want to get out of it, because it's a hard 5 year grind, or maybe at least 5 years. So did you know what you wanted to do after you would graduate?
I actually didn't know what I want to do after I graduate, even a year before graduating. And I think in order to do a PhD, one must be clear that they love research, like because that's the thing which you would be doing in and out. I don't think like you need to have a very defined idea of what you want to get out of the PhD or what you want to do after the PhD. Often like there is a discourse that your choices are limited after the PhD, and I didn't find that to be true. So in my opinion, the choices which you have, like career options, actually expand after a PhD. So you can certainly like be a researcher in academic setting like I am right now, or you can be a researcher in industry. You could be doing like applied research. You could be part of a think tank or a policy tank. You could actually do the software engineering stuff, which I used to do earlier. It's not that anyone is going to stop me like, hey, you have a PhD, you're not eligible to do this. You can have a startup, and there are several examples of people having their startup after the PhD. So the career options are just too many.
You joined University of Washington as a PhD student in computer science. So what type of research did you do? Whom did you work with? And how did you get more exposure into information and communication technologies?
So as I mentioned, like my research was looking at how do we design, build, and evaluate computing technologies for underserved communities. And my work was focusing on three main things. Like the first is like how do we build technologies for underserved communities? And these underserved communities are people with disabilities, people living in poverty, people with limited literacy, women living in societies with deep-rooted patriarchal values. The second aspect of my research was systematizing how people are currently interacting with technologies, what factors impact their use of technology. So this basically means that examining how they are currently using technologies, what factors are influencing their everyday use of technologies, what are their aspirations related to technologies, what are the harms and risks of technologies being deployed to them. And the third aspect of this was building, like once we have built systems which are appropriate, inclusive, accessible, usable, then deploying these systems into the wild for long term to see how do they improve outcomes for underserved communities which we were targeting. So like this was the big umbrella of things of things which we did, which I did along with a lot of other people. And in this, like we designed like social media platforms which are accessible through voice. We designed different kind of crowdsourcing marketplaces which are accessible, like using voice in natural languages, which are accessible even when people do not have smartphones and connectivity. We deployed like several systems in India, in South Asia, in Africa, and those systems were used by hundreds of thousands of users.
What was the first project you worked on?
I was in a privileged position in the sense that I've worked for a couple of years before joining a PhD program. I worked at Microsoft Research, like which is one of the best places to do research. I was working with one of the most outstanding researchers in the field, and so like I had this clarity, I would say, and it's not that the clarity is better when you're joining a PhD program, and there are some disadvantages of knowing what you want to do when you are joining a PhD program. So it's not that knowing what you want to do is always better, but before joining the PhD program, I knew that this is the line of work I would like to do, and I was working on a community moderated social media voice forum. So we designed IVR, interactive voice response based social media platform. Think of voice version of Facebook, voice version of Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
These systems were immensely popular wherever they were deployed. Easily were getting thousands of users just by word of mouth, sometimes tens of thousands of users or hundreds of thousands of users. But there are like inherent limitations. There is a reason why you use Facebook on your smartphone, because everything is in text or video accessible to you in languages which are easy to parse by natural language processing. You are doing this on internet, not on a voice call. So there are certainly like different kinds of usability barriers, scalability barriers, sustainability barriers if you try to do this on a phone call. And so one of the first projects was looking at sustainability and scalability of making these interactive voice response based voice forums more practical.
So, I mean, here, from what I hear, it's that you already had an idea about space and things you wanted to work on, and your advisor would be there to guide you and, to ensure your success and provide their feedback on, things you can do better and things you're doing wrong and things like that.
Like I had this vision, but the path I thought of that vision was very different than the actual path I ended up traversing. So I don't think anyone requires that they have a specific idea or a specific vision in mind before they join a PhD program. But even if I just had a vision of what I want to do, and the path I thought that I would be taking, just can't accentuate it enough, was very different than the path actually I ended up taking. And this is where the community helps you a lot. This is where your advisor, people you are having coffee, people you are having like conversations in the corridors.
So, I mean, it's very interesting dichotomy on being rigid and being open to, ideas and feedback. So what are your thoughts? Because sometimes when someone has an idea or someone has a vision, I mean, they're very passionate about that. And they would want to, grind it through and make things work. But what are your thoughts and how did you balance it yourself?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, like relaxing that vision a little bit, like giving yourself enough freedom. So even if you have a vision, like great, but try to identify how you can find a better route to materialize that vision or to reach that vision, how you can find people around you who are supportive of that vision, how you can actually do better science and how you can create better impact of the society. So just being flexible is good. Just learning from other people, learning from their projects, learning from their own learnings, mistakes and experiences is also really good. So one of the things which all programs want is that I have a PhD in computer science and engineering, right? That means that, and even though like my research is on human computer interaction and information and communication technologies for development, a lot of programs want their graduates to know enough about computer science and engineering that I can have a research conversation with someone who is working on distributed systems with someone who is working on algorithms, and of course with people like in my own area of research, which is HCI and ICTD. So having this exploratory mindset in the initial 1 or 2 years also exposes you to the ins and outs of doing research in some other areas and facilitate in a better development of you as a scholar.
I mean, I wanted to dive deep on this. I mean, a research project, let's say. So, what happens? Like, you might have a certain idea. How do you refine that idea? How do you make sure that, how do you identify research opportunities in that idea? How do you narrow it down? How do you do your research? Do you talk to people? Do you deal with data? Can you walk through that process a bit?
I think like as you rightly mentioned, like it's important to think of this as a process, right? And you use the word process, which I like, because it is indeed a process. It takes time. It doesn't happen like you have an idea and you have clarity about what the methods are going to be. So it's a process in the sense that it evolves with time. It shapes with time. And you have to give yourself time. And then some ideas happen by accident, some ideas, but most of the ideas require a lot of refining. So the first thing is that research has to be concrete. But often, like when you are discussing research projects, like it's important to know that something is achievable, and it's not like overly ambitious in the sense that it can't be done like in a small period of time. And that small period of time could be like 1 year, 2 years, 6 months, even 4 or 5 years. I think it's also important to identify tractable problems, as I was discussing, like tractable problems which are also addressable by technology, right? I mean, given that I'm a computer scientist. So all I'm trying to say here is that it's super useful to spend a lot of time just thinking about the problem and refining it, scoping it appropriately, and not worry if you're spending a lot of time just knowing like what your research is going to be about. People think a lot about what problems they are going to work on. It's not that they know at the outset that this is the exact thing which I want to work on. And identifying the right problem, scoping the problem correctly, like is an important part of the PhD process or research process more widely.
I mean, so I have one follow up, which is like when you share ideas, it's more or less like sharing a startup idea, and then one is always scared about that. Someone else might do it faster than you would. So how do you balance that out?
Yeah, so personally, like I don't worry about it that much. That my research idea is out there. Like sometimes I actually also see this as an opportunity to get collaborators, to get people who are really interested in this space, who are thinking about these questions, or who have the same research vision. And that said, like you should do this with people you are comfortable with. Like you're not going to go to someone like who you don't know at all, and you're not like, it doesn't make sense to get their time to give you feedback. In some cases it does, but generally like you're doing this with your peers, your advisor, colleagues, friends. So it's a safe environment to do that.
And then how self-critical do you have to be? Because I mean, you have ideas, you read literature out there, you have to criticize things and say that, hey, this is how you can refine your ideas. So is there a process that you follow?
So a couple of things here. Like the first thing is that, yeah, I mean, being self-critical is important, right? I mean, if you won't find the gaps in your obvious gaps in your work, then others would, and they would, because research is mostly like peer reviewed, right? I mean, whatever work I'm doing is reviewed by my colleagues in other institutions, like who are not conflicted with me, and they decide like whether this research contribution is enough or not. So it's important for you to find those gaps yourself, again, like with the help of your colleagues, with the help of your advisor. But at the same time, this process of self criticizing and trying to find the excellent product, the perfect product, should not be stopping you from making any progress. So it's important that this process of self-criticizing, self-critiquing the work, which this work is not impeding your ability to do the work itself. That you are just in this mode of like criticizing, reflecting, probably making some improvements, and then again criticizing, reflecting, and then making some improvements, and then you are in this rut. So you don't want to do that either. So of course you want to fix the obvious gaps. You want to have conversations with with your champions, with your colleagues about whether they see any gaps or not, but don't wait for the perfect conditions to continue pushing or doing the research.
And then what happens, and then you put in all this effort, you discuss with people, you criticize yourself, you come up with like a solution. What happens if the data does not yield the results that you anticipated, or maybe your publication is not accepted? So how do you deal with failure?
So failures is an inevitable part of the research process, and yeah, I mean, it would prepare you to be the PhD process would prepare you to accept the failures with grace as well, in the sense that many times when people are critiquing your things, there is a truth behind it. Like there are some weaknesses, and if you won't get those critical comments, then your growth of as a researcher is not complete. So often, I mean, and I have submitted my papers to a lot of places. My papers have been rejected a lot of times, like too many times to count. And I'm in a stage like where it doesn't affect me whether the paper is rejected or not, because I see this as a fantastic opportunity to submit a better version of the paper or a better version of the research. Now, that better version of research may come at the cost of refining the research question, like collecting the data again, but it's worth it because there were like obvious gaps and weaknesses in the work. And so I would rather submit a stronger paper, even though it goes through like 3 revision cycles, like where twice it's rejected, the third time it's accepted, rather than a weak paper which is accepted the first time. Because all I care about is like making strong research contributions, and this process like helps me make and other researchers make strong research contributions most of the time.
You just mentioned like submitting papers in like and then getting them peer reviewed. So just wanted to spend some time to talk about the paper writing process a bit. It's I mean, I have written papers myself, and then it's very difficult to write in a concise language, and just to write for the sake of writing. So can you share your process a bit about writing papers?
The process which I use is I don't start like diving into the writing unless like I have clarity about what I want to say. So often like I start with a document, a Word document, a Google document, a LaTeX document, like where I have like sections, and for each of these sections, like bullet points of what I want to say. So if the narrative itself doesn't make sense to me, then I'm pretty sure like even if I go into the weeds of writing it, like it's not going to make sense. So like think of this as a storyboarding process. So when you are making a movie or like an animation, like you have a storyboard, and that storyboard is super useful for people to see like what's the story is, like how the story is developing, what's going on in each of these scenes. And I try to emulate a similar process where for my paper, I have different sections, and for each of these sections, like I have bullet points which convey the narrative, the key points I would like to raise in the section. And then I start writing. And even while writing a paper, I don't do it sequentially, like section 1 first, section 2 first, section 3 first. Like often I'm writing methodology the first, then findings, then discussion, then related work, then introduction. So I don't think like it's a good idea to dive into the paper. I think like there are certainly some good writing practices which people should use. So like generally using active language rather than passive language, writing short sentences rather than like long sentences, using simple words rather than like complicated words.
So do you block your time when you're writing?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I block my time. And I also like to focus on only writing, like when I'm writing. So rather than like, oh, let me write for an hour, then like go back to 3 meetings, then come back to writing. So ideally, like I would like to have 3 hours of writing. And of course, where I'm taking breaks in between, but not too much context switch. People have different styles, and there are, I don't know, like if there are better or worse ways of writing.
So now when you write a paper, you have to submit it to a conference or a journal, and then other people would review your work and then would give you feedback on things you can do better. But sometimes it's an art to give feedback. So what's your process of giving good feedback, or what do you keep in mind?
Yeah, so there are 2 aspects of it. Like the first one is when you are writing a review, and the second one is when you are like receiving a review. I'll start like with the other one, like receiving a review. So if you receive a harsh review, a very harsh critique, It's better to sleep on it rather than like react instantaneously. It's better to like think about the points which they are raising rather than the tone which they are using, and try to get as much possible like constructive pieces from it, which refines your work. Because your best interest is that you refine your work, right? When you're writing a review, it's super important that you write a review which you would like to read for your work.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that you're all praises, but what it really means is that the tone which you're using is respectful, that you're recognizing the contributions of the work. It's there are when you read a paper, there are certainly like a lot of things which you like in it, and there are certainly like some things which you don't like in the paper. And sometimes like people tend to focus on negatives a lot when writing the review. And as an author yourself, like it's very reassuring when people say like this is the thing which you did really well.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're writing the review, ensuring that you're also talking about the positives of the work, also talking about the significance of the work, also trying to read into what authors meant, even if they didn't like present it as eloquently like as you wanted. So talking about the significance of the work, talking about the strengths of the work, like the strength could be in methodology, the strength could be that they are targeting a really difficult problem where there is not much data. I don't know. Like, I mean, it varies from a paper to paper. But it's important that you're acknowledging strengths. It's important that you are respectful in your opinions. It's important that you're backing your criticism as well.
And now, like coming back to your career journey a bit. So you are now a professor at Cornell, and like this is like right after you finished your PhD from University of Washington. So what made you decide to join academia?
I really enjoy the process of like coming up with novel research ideas, identifying the right problems, finding appropriate solutions towards these problems, evaluating them using mixed methods approach. So I really like enjoy this process. But the biggest reason is students, mentoring them. I really enjoyed the mentoring process at UW. I benefited a lot from the mentorship which I received. I also mentored a lot of people at the University of Washington in my PhD program. And I found this entire process of being mentored and receiving and being a mentor and giving mentorship like very, very rewarding.
Now I want to shift focus to know more about Aditya as a person. So how do you unwind?
I love reading fiction. I love watching movies or TV shows. I love badminton, squash, swimming. So some of these, and spending time with family.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say these are the four things which I love the most.
I mean, so you have to get a lot of like deep work done in your variety of things you do right now. So how do you do that? Mm-hmm.
So anything is not going to happen by accident. So being a little bit careful about how I'm structuring my activities, ensuring that there is dedicated blocks of time for thinking, for reading papers, for writing. So just doing that. I'm an early morning person, and someone could be like a late night person, but basically like trying to do the most difficult tasks, whatever they are, or most demanding tasks when I'm most alert, when I'm most productive, like is another way in which I try to organize my schedule.
I mean, so throughout your journey, you have to learn a lot of things, but you also would have to unlearn a few things. So how do you learn and unlearn things?
Yeah, so great question. Great question. I actually don't know how to respond to it. But firstly, like knowing what you have to unlearn, sometimes it takes a while for people or for me to recognize that this is something I need to change.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm a schedule person. Like so like just putting that in practice, of not doing that thing or unlearning that thing or learning that process. So like being cognizant about it and then instituting it like in a systematic way to avoid doing the same thing which I need to unlearn or undo.
And then lastly, what advice would you give to a 21 or 22-year-old Aditya who is just finishing undergrad?
Have fun first. be fearless, explore more, take risks.
Mm-hmm.
4 advices, not just one.
Yeah, fair enough. And then we are at the last section of the podcast. We'll do a quick rapid fire round and say the first thing that comes to your mind. Yeah. So, best place you have traveled to?
Home.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Your favorite grad school memory?
It's a slightly longer answer. So I had 2 advisors in grad school, like in my PhD. Unfortunately, one of them passed away in my second year of graduation. So my favorite memory is a day before he passed away. There was a celebration of my advisor's life,
Mm-hmm.
and it was very heartwarming to see people he has impacted, and
Mm-hmm.
that atrium overflowing
Yeah.
with emotions, which people had for my advisor. So that's my favorite grad school memory.
That's
Not
wonderful.
happy though, sad memory, but favorite.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I mean, one mistake that you made as a grad student that you did not make as a professor.
Not to have more time for conversations. So sometimes, like as a grad student, I was like, oh, I have to do this, I have to do that. So finding more time for conversations with people.
And then now you have a young kid. So if you had to choose between changing diapers and writing recommendations, what would you choose?
If you ask me today, it would be changing diapers. If you ask me like 2 months from now, it would be writing recommendations.
And then lastly, so you did your grad school in Seattle where it rains a lot, and now you're in Ithaca where it snows. So if you had to choose between one, what would you choose?
Washington rains. Seattle is one of my favorite cities in the world.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So that's the end of the podcast, Aditya. Thank you so much for your time. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
Thank you, Kushal. I enjoyed it a lot.
We hope that you enjoyed listening to this episode with Aditya. And please don't forget to subscribe to Nails and Hammers on the platform of your choice.